The movie begins with Jiminy Cricket floating into a small Italian town from his umbrella and narrating a story that occurred long ago. Young Jiminy walks on the streets of the village and wonders if he will get warm again. He goes to a woodcarver store and enters through a space under the door. Geppetto, the store owner, works at his table while Jiminy stays beside the fireplace and gets warm. Jiminy climbs on some objects and watches as Geppetto constructs a puppet out of wood. Geppetto has a picture of his late son beside him, making the puppet out of grief. He completes the puppet and hears a knock on his window. He sees Rizzy and opens the door for him. Rizzy begs Geppetto to sell his cuckoo clocks to him and says he is willing to pay any price. Geppetto refuses and says the clocks aren't for sale. Rizzy leaves the house, and Geppetto tells Figaro, his cat, that his clocks are his most prized possession and his wife loved them. Geppetto decides to name the puppet and thinks of a name for it. He realizes he used pine wood to make the puppet and decides to name it Pinocchio. He moves Pinocchio around and scares Figaro in the process. The cuckoo clocks ring and Geppetto realizes it's time for bed. He tells his pets good night and gets on his bed. He looks outside, sees a wishing star, and decides to make a wish. Geppetto doesn't know what to wish for, but eventually decides as Jiminy watches. He gets into bed and goes to sleep, imagining how happy he will be if his wish comes true. While Geppetto sleeps, a strange light shines on his late son's picture. The light connects to Pinocchio, and Pinocchio comes to life. Jiminy wakes up and is surprised when he sees Pinocchio. Pinocchio gets tangled in his ropes, and a blue fairy enters the house. She untangles Pinocchio and helps him talk properly. Jiminy tells her that Geppetto is Pinocchio's father, and she wonders why he made a wooden boy when he wished for a real one. Pinocchio asks the blue fairy if he can become a real boy, and she says he has to prove he can be brave, truthful, and unselfish. The blue fairy tells Pinocchio he'll have to know the difference between right and wrong and says his conscience will help him. Pinocchio doesn't know what a conscience is, and she decides to appoint Jiminy as his conscience till he grows one. She tells Pinocchio that the most important part of being real is what is in his heart. The blue fairy sings as she leaves the house, and Geppetto wakes up. He walks around as he searches for the source of the noise that woke him up, and he gets startled by Pinocchio. Geppetto is startled at first but gets excited as he realizes his wish has come true. He grabs Pinocchio as he celebrates and says they can be a family. He turns on some music and dances with Pinocchio as they live as a happy family. As Geppetto gets on his bed, he tells Pinocchio that he should go to school, and Pinocchio gets excited. Pinocchio steps out of the house the following day, and Geppetto gives him a book and an apple for his teacher. He hesitates as he lets Pinocchio leave the house, and Pinocchio promises to return home immediately after school. Jiminy wakes up and realizes that Pinocchio has gone to school. He rushes outside and meets a seagull named Sophia. He begs her to take her to Pinocchio because he walks around without a conscience, and she agrees to help him. Meanwhile, Honest John, a con man in Fox, and his assistant see Pinocchio and realizes that Stromboli, a puppeteer, will pay him a fortune for Pinocchio. They rush to Pinocchio and make him fall, but pretend to help him stand up. He informs them that he wants to be a real boy and go to school. John tells Pinocchio that he can become a real boy if he becomes famous. He also says that Pinocchio doesn't need to attend school but will make his father proud. Pinocchio agrees to be famous and follows John as they walk on the street. Sophia and Jiminy see Pinocchio with John, and Jiminy lands on his hat. His assistant tries hitting him with a mallet but accidentally knocks out John. I talks to Pinocchio, and Pinocchio tells him about Honest John's offer. Jiminy tells Pinocchio that Honest John isn't honest and is just tempting him to do what's wrong. Pinocchio decides to listen to Jiminy and says he wants to go to school. They run to the school, and Jiminy informs Pinocchio that he can't follow him into the school because teachers don't like insects. Pinocchio runs into the school while John and his assistant hide in some bushes. Shortly after Pinocchio enters the school, he gets kicked out by a teacher, and the teacher says that the school is for real children and Pinocchio is a puppet. Pinocchio gets upset and John traps Jiminy in a glass jar. John and his assistant rush to Pinocchio and tell him he doesn't need the school. Pinocchio decides to follow them, and they leave while John sings. Geppetto sees that Pinocchio hasn't returned home for dinner that night. He takes his fish Cleo and Figaro and decides to search for Pinocchio. Meanwhile, Pinocchio prepares for a show. talks to a girl named Fabiana and tells her he wants to become famous. She introduces him to Sabina, her puppet, and he sees that she has an injury on her leg. Stromboli welcomes Pinocchio and opens the curtains. Pinocchio begins to dance but gets stuck on a floorboard as the audience laughs at him. Sabina helps him get free, and he continues his performance. He dances with other puppets and his legs catch fire as he moves extremely fast. The audience cheers as they throw money at Pinocchio. Later that night, Pinocchio enters Fabiana's room and realizes she is a ballerina. She makes Pinocchio dance with Sabina, and Stromboli enters. He informs Fabiana that they'll leave in an hour and he grabs Pinocchio. Stromboli takes Pinocchio to his room and locks him in a bird cage. Pinocchio cries as he screams for his father, and Jiminy Stromboli calls him his gold mine and leaves the room. Fabiana talks to Pinocchio through the roof and informs him that she's planning on escaping from Stromboli. She uses Sabina to talk to Pinocchio and shows him where the key to the cage is. Stromboli enters the room as Fabiana runs away. He locks the roof and leaves the room. Jiminy remains stuck in the jar and Stromboli's carriage passes him. He sees Pinocchio trapped in the cage, and a rock from the carriage hits the jar. Jiminy escapes the jar and rushes to the carriage. He reunites with Pinocchio and tries unlocking the cage but cannot. He tells Pinocchio that he's suffering for his decision that is mad, and Pinocchio lies that he didn't want to be famous. His nose grows and Jiminy informs him that it's due to fairy magic. He lies until his nose reaches the key, and Jiminy retrieves the key. Pinocchio begins telling the truth and his nose goes back to normal. Pinocchio escapes the cage and they run through the town. He tells Jiminy about the people who helped him and they run into a coach that carries several children out of the town. The coachman carries Pinocchio and places him in the coach with the kids. The kids see Pinocchio and he meets a mischievous boy named Lampwick. Pinocchio says he needs to find his conscience and they say he won't need it on Pleasure Island. Lampwick informs Pinocchio that Pleasure Island is lawless because there are no rules and the kids can do whatever they want. The coachman tells Pinocchio that he won't be a puppet on Pleasure Island, but Pinocchio says he doesn't trust him. He stops the coach and tells the kids that Pinocchio doubts him. The coachman begins singing and tells Pinocchio he must decide if he wants to follow them or return to his home. He tells Pinocchio that real boys always want more, and Pinocchio decides to follow them to Pleasure Island. The coach begins to move, leaving Germany behind. The kids arrive at Pleasure Island and have fun on the rides. Pinocchio sits beside Lampwick as they drink root beer and ride on a boat. Pinocchio watches as the kids vandalize several buildings and steal some items. The kids are violent and lawless as they do whatever they want. Pinocchio watches as the kids destroy some clocks and Lampwick uses his catapult to break a clock. Meanwhile, Geppetto walks on the beach as he searches for Pinocchio. Sophia flies to him with a flyer that shows Pleasure Island. Jiminy arrives on the island and watches as some shadowy figures abduct a donkey and place it in a cage. Lampwick plays pool while Pinocchio watches. Jiminy enters the room but Lampwick pushes him into the drainage pipes. He gets underground and watches as the shadowy figures gather several donkeys, place them in cages and board them on a ship. The coachman emerges and Jiminy realizes that he controls the shadowy creatures. He plans to sell the donkeys to the salt mines to get paid as Lampwick plays pool. His ears transform into donkey ears and he grows a tail. Lampwick begins to panic as he begs for help and eventually transforms into a donkey. Jiminy emerges from the pipes and the coachman enters the room with the shadowy creatures. He sees Pinocchio and tries to capture him, but he escapes with Jiminy and jumps into the ocean. Pinocchio returns to Geppetto's house, where they see it's locked. Sophia meets them and says that Geppetto sold all his clocks to purchase a boat that'll help him get to Pleasure Island. Pinocchio and Jiminy run to the beach and see Stromboli's coach approaching. Pinocchio hides, but Sabina and Fabiana meet him. She informs him that Stromboli got arrested by the Carabinieri. They ask him if he can join their show as the headliner, but Pinocchio refuses and says he has to find his father. His donkey ears and tail disappear, and Sabina informs him he made the right decision. She hugs him and tells him goodbye as they leave. Jiminy tells Pinocchio that Geppetto left 2 hours ago and they decide to get into the ocean and find him. Pinocchio holds a rope attached to Sophia and glides on the water as she swims. They see a tiny boat in the distance and Sophia informs them she sees Geppetto. Pinocchio calls out to Geppetto and Geppetto sees him. He stops his boat and waits for Pinocchio. Pinocchio tells Geppetto about his adventure as he moves toward him. Geppetto says he hasn't had a fracture of Pinocchio's adventure and says that he has forgiven Pinocchio for making him worried. Pinocchio gets close to Geppetto, but they get swallowed by Monstro, a giant sea monster. Pinocchio reunites with Geppetto in the monster's mouth and gets on his boat. They get on a larger boat and Pinocchio realizes that the small boat still floats. Pinocchio gets an idea and they light a fire in Monstro's mouth. They get on the small boat and reunite with Jiminy as he gets on the boat. Monstro sneezes because of the smoke, propelling their boat out of its mouth. Pinocchio places Geppetto on the boat and paddles as Monstro chases them. Monstro gets close to Pinocchio and the others and pushes them to the shore as it tries to eat them. Pinocchio sees Geppetto lying on the beach and realizes he isn't moving. He cries as he begs Geppetto not to die, and his teardrop lands on Geppetto as he sings. Geppetto gets revived because of the magic teardrop and he sees that Pinocchio, Cleo, and Figaro are alive and safe. He tells Pinocchio that he is a brave, truthful, and unselfish boy. Geppetto tells Pinocchio that he is proud of him and loves him. They hug and Pinocchio says that they should get home. Pinocchio holds Geppetto's hand as they make their way home. His leg transforms into that of a human child and Jiminy narrates that no one knows if he transformed into a real boy. He says that Pinocchio's heart is as real as any real boy's. The end. Thank you for watching Story Recap. Check out these other videos and make sure to subscribe and tap the bell to be notified about our latest videos. See you next time.